Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual roundtable on conservation, climate change, and COVID-19. We're thrilled to have two wonderful guest speakers with us today, Dr. Kyle White and Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, and I will introduce them a little bit more formally in a few minutes. But we have a lot to cover in 90 minutes, so we are going to go ahead and get started. But a couple housekeeping notes to start off with. One, you'll notice all participants, you're both muted and your videos are turned off. That's because we have a large group with us today and it'd be a little hard to manage if everybody's sound and video was on. If you need to get in touch with us during the roundtable though, you can use the chat box. If you have questions for our speakers during the roundtable, we ask that you don't use the chat box, and we also ask that you don't use the Q&A box. We're going to use a special link today, and we'll have more information about that in just a moment. So please reserve your questions for that special link, and then everything else you can use the chat box, and we will try to be as responsive as we can. The next thing I would like to do before we get started, I'm going to launch a poll. So everyone should see a poll come up. We're just trying to get a sense of where everyone is coming from today. We know we have a really wide, diverse audience, and so this is just going to help our speakers understand everybody's perspective and hopefully to dig into these topics a little bit more meaningfully. So take a second and respond to that. I'll keep it open for another maybe 10 seconds or so. And I'll close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. I'm going to share the results. Hopefully everyone sees that. We have a lot of state agency folks with us today. That's great. But we're so glad to have everyone. Everyone is welcome to this roundtable. Thank you so much for being here. We're really looking forward to the audience Q&A a little bit later today. All right, so the last thing before we kind of formally get started, I just wanted to mention that this roundtable is brought to you today by the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Network. This network is a multi-sector collaborative body that works to advance climate adaptation in the natural resource community. And I most especially want to highlight some of our network members today that have worked so hard to organize this roundtable. You see all of their names listed below. I'm Maggie Johnson. I'm with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. We also have with us today Amy Delac and Ted Weber of Defenders of Wildlife, as well as Mike Langston of the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, Robert Newman of University of North Dakota, and Tracy Melvin of Michigan State University. So today would not have been possible without all of their hard work. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So what I'm first going to do is pass the ball over to my friend and colleague, Tracy Melvin, and she's going to speak a little bit more about why we're here and what we're hoping to get out of today. So Tracy, feel free to take it away and just let me know when you want me to change the slide.
You can go ahead and change it right now, Maggie. So thanks so much for being here. I'll just take a quick second to explain our goals for today. My internet's a little bit unstable right now because of the weather, so hopefully I don't break up too much. So we came together and we're venting on our annual call, which you can be a part of to join the network. We'll share that information with you. And we wanted to be able to come together and share knowledge about how to deal and how you are dealing and what your stresses are regarding COVID-19, especially as a conservation practitioner. The second big goal is to say, okay, knowing what we have learned from this, how can we apply it to climate change, especially with your personal experiences? Give you a voice, and we did that with a survey, and Ted's going to go over the results of that in a second here. But we want to further that voice, right? So if you would like to join the network, please consider that, because the network is a really special opportunity and way to collectively move climate change forward, climate adaptation forward, and society at large forward through our collective experiences across the country and throughout the intersections of our different organizations that we're a part of. So, and the slide you see here today, right in front of you right now, you'll see that you can go to this website that Catherine has. It's a poll everywhere. You might have done that before. It's super easy. Put your name in. You can be anonymous. And we already have some questions up. Not only can you add your own personal questions to this for both of our speakers or for the panel at large, but you can also upvote and downvote these questions as well. So I'll also add this to the chat as people come in a couple times. So you might see that as folks come in late. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ted. So Ted can start talking about results from the survey.
I am going to share my screen here. So yeah, we sent a questionnaire to conservation and climate professionals and asked for feedback about how the COVID-19 pandemic was affecting them, as well as its implications for conservation and climate change. And 109 people responded, which was great. I'm going to summarize these responses very briefly, and we'll provide more detail in an upcoming report, and the slides will also be available, so don't feel you have to copy anything down. The first question asked what you thought was the biggest threat to conservation from the COVID-19 pandemic. Respondents identified a potential loss of revenue from budget cuts as the largest threat to conservation due to the pandemic, followed closely by a pause in research or restoration initiatives. An emerging theme was a worry that the focus on the pandemic may de-emphasize the importance of conservation and climate change. The second question was how the pandemic has personally affected your work. 71% of respondents reported working from home. 36% cited an inability to get to a field site or laboratory. Childcare or lack thereof has also been a substantial impact to work productivity. And over half of respondents indicated that they expect a decrease in funds to support their work within the next year. But only 14% reported that they've made contingency plans. On the fourth question, respondents noted a reduction in climate adaptation and conservation work resulting from altered priorities, reductions in funding, and opportunities to get anything done. They also noted increased interest in outdoor recreation that is positive in terms of appreciation for nature, but often negative in increased impacts on wildlife habitat. On the path back question, respondents were most concerned about the financial impacts of the shutdown and the loss of valuable research data. Many mentioned that they expect that the future will include a greater reliance on technology for both meetings and data collection. Some expressed optimism that agencies can capitalize on a renewed interest in outdoor recreation. Others expressed a desire for change, to rethink the way we do things or to reconsider our priorities. One wrote that this crisis gives us the opportunity to take giant leaps forward, not just small ones. Overall, there seems to be a sense that we're in the midst of a watershed moment, that significant change is coming. Some fear financial repercussions, while others see opportunity for conservation and technological advances. So the next question was about what we can learn. The summary wouldn't fit entirely in the slide here, but it'll be in the report. So respondents said that the coronavirus pandemic demonstrated the need for adequate planning and preparation and international cooperation, things that are needed to adapt to coming climate change. The pandemic also illustrates societal divides that need to be addressed. Many thought that the pandemic showed that people could work together to solve big problems, but other respondents thought otherwise, that people are unwilling to make necessary changes. Scientists need to improve communications with the public and policymakers and be better spokespersons for action. Some respondents noted that native plants and wildlife can thrive with less human disturbance, consistent with other questions, as long as we control invasive species and diseases and enforce laws like against poaching. Next, we asked what an ideal future might look like. Some called for a shift in societal values, better leadership, or increased reliance on science and decision-making, while others enumerated more concrete actions to mitigate and adapt to climate change, increase awareness, conserve land and species, and build a sustainable and inclusive economy. Finally, we asked what practitioners would most like to study and who they want on their team. Respondents hope to study combinations of stressors like pollution, habitat fragmentation, invasive species, and climate change, and solutions to simultaneous problems. Almost all dream teams are interdisciplinary and included not just ecologists, but economists, social scientists, communications experts, and keepers of indigenous knowledge. Major themes included increasing the depth and breadth of managerial decision space, creating globally informed conservation, including environmental justice, effectively reaching the public, creating reserve networks, and studying social and economic drivers. So I'm going to turn it back to Maggie now.
Thank you so much, Ted. There is certainly a lot to unpack from the results of our questionnaire. So now it's my honor and my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers today. So first, I would like to introduce Dr. Kyle White. So Dr. White is the Timnick Chair in the Humanities and Professor of Philosophy and Community Sustainability at Michigan State University. His work focuses on climate and environmental justice and Indigenous environmental studies, working to address moral and political issues concerning climate policy and Indigenous peoples. Dr. White has received numerous awards, including MSU's Distinguished Partnership Award for Community Engaged Research and MSU's Community Engagement Scholarship Award, both in 2020. Also with us today is Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. Dr. Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist and professor of political science at Texas Tech University, where she is the director of the Climate Science Center. In 2019, she was named UN Champion of the Earth, the UN's highest environmental honor. She is also the CEO of the consulting firm Atmos Research and Consulting, and is well known for her public talks on climate science, impacts, communication, and faith. So welcome, Dr. White, Dr. Hayhoe. Thank you so much for being here today. What I wanted to start with is have both of you kind of share some of your thoughts and perspectives on the current moment as it relates to the conservation and climate change community. So why don't we start first with Dr. White. So Dr. White, please offer your thoughts and perspectives for this moment.
Bonjour, everybody, and thanks for the invitation to connect with you all, and I look forward to the conversation. I wanted to pose some some questions and pose some points to everybody that both come from my perspective as a Potawatomi person, as a Native person and tribal member, but also from the fact that, like many of you, my work is focused in conservation and climate change planning, as well as other aspects of environmental stewardship and environmental justice. And first, what I wanted to just start with is thinking through what many of us have learned, either through our families, our communities, or through the news, about what Indigenous people are facing due to the public health crisis with COVID-19. What does that mean for our work in conservation and climate change? What's it telling us? What's it telling us about communities that we may have worked with, about tribal governments that we have may have worked with for years, or just on one project? And I think this is important to really take a moment and reflect on the context and its significance to how we envision our work moving forward. So many of you have seen, for example, that one of the key problems that some tribes have encountered is the complete inadequate levels of funding for the Indian Health Service, as well as other challenges such as vacancies within the staff. We've seen issues where tribes have had challenges in finding the best ways to report the data that's happening. We've seen issues tied to tribes trying to figure out how to make sure other people don't irresponsibly engage their communities, and to have a sense of sovereignty and self-determination to be able to enact public health standards. We've seen individual Native people struggle with the high prices of food, with access issues, given that they may have to travel a long way away to get access to food they depend on. We've seen issues related to access to water tied to increasing the amount of exposure that Native people face to the coronavirus. And, I think the story we're getting is that all of these examples, and there's many more, are tied to issues that Native people have wanted to be addressed for years, and they haven't been addressed. They're issues of capacity. They're issues of tribes having the self-determination to build an economic base to support a diverse portfolio of businesses that can then also support key programs like health and conservation and climate change. And so we're seeing generations of land dispossession, generations of policy neglect, and inadequate ways of conceiving of funding and providing funding all come together. And I think for many of us, if we think about what many of our colleagues working for tribes or family members we have, others we know in the Native community, when they've talked about issues of conservation and climate change, they've been very direct that it's an issue of health. It's an issue of capacity. It's an issue of food. It's an issue of territorial rights. And one of the challenges I've found with at least some people I've worked with in the conservation community is they've only looked at their work with tribes on a project by project basis, or as a checkbox for diversity. And so the work together was seen as part of a very, very small story. How do we get this project done? Where Native people have called for conservation and climate change work as being part of a much, much larger story, a story across generations of how our communities have done the impossible. We've rebuilt ourselves after experiencing some of the most horrific forms of colonialism, discrimination, sexism and patriarchy, ableism. And we've had a continuance, and we've adapted, and in some ways we've achieved outcomes that I think many of our ancestors, while they would be cheering us on, they would have been extremely daunted by, and were uncertain about what the future would be. And with respect specifically to climate change, climate change for Native people, and this is borne out in a lot of the scientific studies, you have cases of Native people facing climate change issues right now, facing risks and harms right now, as well as Native people that are talking about the imminence of certain climate change impacts that if things keep going in the way that they have, they're going to be facing in the future. But regardless, right, both the planning of climate change, but also the mitigation and remediation of climate change issues happening right now, they're all matters of coordination. They're matters of capacity. And I think similar to what the public health crisis is showing is that you don't develop capacities overnight. Capacities are built through generations, not just through a current infusion of funding, but consistent, adequate funding over the years. And for state and federal employees, as well as staff of nonprofit organizations and universities who are dedicated to building relationships with tribal agencies, with indigenous NGOs, with multi-tribal organizations and treaty organizations for the long term, where the goal is long-term coordinated capacity. And not just the achievement of a particular project, but an overall relationship that will endure, that will not end when, a state or federal staff member gets a promotion or moves on to another job, or when there's turnover within a tribe or an indigenous NGO. Because I don't think in the work that we are all doing, we want to be in the situation where when a community is in the process of relocating, or when a culturally relevant species is almost impossible for Native people to access, that there's just not going to be the capacity or the coordination to be able to manage those imminent and urgent situations. And so I hope very much that, conservation and climate change professionals are really contextualizing some of the things that they've heard Native people say to them, whether it's about health, whether it's about politics, whether it's about land dispossession, as they relate to conservation and climate change, with what we've learned about Native communities through the COVID-19 public health crisis. Because I think oftentimes for those of us who are so focused in particular professional fields, we only hear words like health, or we only hear words like food, or we only hear words like a climate change plan, just in a very specific context. But oftentimes the people who say those things, they're referring to the larger story. They're referring to the overall situation, and they're referring to topics and issues they know that their ancestors, that the closer generations were also raising in different ways, and it still aren't settled yet. And so I want people to actually be energized in their work in conservation, and to see that maybe, at least for some of us, not all of us, we might have lost track of what's at stake, and we might have lost track of the importance of long-term relationships, and how the capacities that come out of those are ones that we don't want to be left wanting for when issues that we have been anticipating for a long time come to a head. Thanks for giving me a chance to share with you all. I look forward to connecting further over the course of the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. White. That was great. Now I'll ask Dr. Hayhoe, will you please, share some of your thoughts and perspectives on this current moment? Welcome.
Thank you, and absolutely, and thank you, Kyle, for that perspective. So often we think about things only from our own perspective, and recognizing the diversity of other perspectives and other ways of thinking about the problems that we have and the solutions that we need, I think, is essential. So I am a climate scientist. As part of the South Central Climate Science and Adaptation Center, we also work closely with the tribal nations, primarily in Oklahoma. But I also work at the global scale, since climate change is a global issue. And so what I want to do is I want to share some slides with you here, just a second. And I'm going to begin by reminding everyone that go ahead and keep asking questions if you want. We already have about 7 or 8 questions. A few of them have been upvoted to the top, but you've got plenty of time to continue to ask questions. You don't have to register. If it asks for your name, just click skip, and you can go ahead and see the questions and upvote them. Now, just to confirm, you can see my screen changing. Is that right, Maggie?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I always like to check. So We often think of climate change as this global issue, which we know affects us in the places where we live. And as we can tell by the headlines, year after year, we are breaking record after record. The headlines today, if you caught them this morning, are that the Siberian heat wave from a couple of weeks ago, where it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in some parts of Siberia, was virtually impossible. It would not have occurred in the absence of human-induced climate change. When we go to the Climate Action Tracker, we know that we've already seen a 1 degree Celsius warming in the average temperature of the planet. According to the Paris Agreement, almost every country in the world agreed to try to keep temperature in the yellow zone there on this thermometer. But according to our current policies, we're nowhere near that. We're likely to end up somewhere between 3 to 4 degrees based on our current policies. We know that if we want to reduce our carbon emissions consistent with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement, we have to cut them by 40 to 60% by 2030. That's where the whole 12 years to the world ends come from, which is not true. All it means is we need to start cutting our emissions seriously by 2030 to give ourselves just a 66% chance of meeting that green zone on the thermometer. So this is where we were, and this is what we were worried about in January. New headlines were telling us at the beginning of the year that our fossil fuel emissions continued to go up rather than down. When you look at the planetary boundaries, I don't know if you're familiar with this concept by Rockstrom, but when we looked at the planetary boundaries, we were very concerned about the boundary of climate change. Not because a 1 or 2 degree warming in the average temperature of the planet matters per se, but because climate change is a threat multiplier. It affects everything that we already care about. It takes issues of water scarcity, food, our ecosystem integrity, even the economy and the health of ourselves and every living thing on this planet, and it makes them worse. That's why we care about climate change. Not because this is its own issue, but because all the other issues at the top of our priority list, which I took a quick peek at the questions and I saw the number one was about environmental justice. If we care about environmental justice, if we care about justice of any kind, then we automatically care about climate change, because the only reason we care about it is because it already affects everything at the top of our lists. Whether it's an invasive species, an endangered species, an ecosystem we're trying to manage or protect, no matter what we care about, we already care about climate change because it's affecting those things. So there we were thinking about climate change, and then along came coronavirus sneaking up behind us when now I say we, but epidemiologists had already thought of this happening for sure. When most of us were not paying attention, up comes the coronavirus pandemic and it bites us in the rear. Biospheric integrity has already far surpassed our planetary boundaries into the area of very high risk. And the timing of this report by WWF Italia was impeccable. They released this report in March from the Italian chapter of WWF. It was called The Loss of Nature and the Rise of Pandemics. And it talks about how biospheric integrity is key to preventing zoonosis, and how the current pandemic is due to the destruction and the modification of our natural ecosystems. If you haven't seen this report, it's very short and I strongly advise taking a quick look at it. So the pandemic rolled over us. I was caught on a speaking trip in Ireland where, to reduce my carbon footprint, I bundled together all the invitations I get, and then I only go somewhere when I have a lot of them. I had 18 talks and panels in 11 days. The pandemic rolled over us right in the middle of those. And despite all the negativity, we've seen some slightly positive news. I always try to look for positive news. Now, these goats were not native. They're Kashmiri goats roaming the hills of Wales. But we've seen animals taking over cities. We've seen pictures of incredibly blue skies. Over here on the right, you see a before and after of the India Gate War Memorial in New Delhi. We've seen blue skies. We've seen pollution drop massively over some of the most polluted areas in the world. Here looking at nitrogen dioxide over China. And interestingly, we're doing an AGU session on this if you're interested. AGU is entirely online this year. We have an AGU session that I'm doing with Marshall Burke, who did this study. Marshall Burke from Stanford found that in some of the most polluted areas in the world, the easing of air pollution, which kills almost 9 million people per year. 9 million people per year die from air pollution on a normal year. The easing of air pollution could have saved as many lives as were lost to the coronavirus pandemic. That's not to say it was a blessing in any way, shape, or form. Any premature death is too much. But it shows us that we take for granted the fact that somehow 9 million deaths per year, 200,000 of those in the US from air pollution, is somehow acceptable price to pay for our economy and our society based on fossil fuels. We now know, thanks to this multi-author paper that came out just recently, we now know that global carbon emissions decreased by 17% in the month of May globally, thanks to the shutdowns related to the pandemic. But here's the bad news, and this relates to a question I saw too, so I just put these in quickly to answer your question. The bad news is, as of February, climate change and environmental protections were the most politically polarized issues in the entire United States. And you know what else is now? Coronavirus. Our response to coronavirus, whether we think it's a big deal, whether we're willing to wear a mask, whether we think the shutdowns worked, our response to coronavirus is affected by our position on the political spectrum as well. If you're interested in learning more, I recommend this article by psychologist Justin Murphy, where he talks about how it is that our brains somehow take information, in the case of both climate change and coronavirus, the same information, and we process it differently depending on how we fall on the political spectrum. That is bad news. The furthermore bad news, as I explained in a Twitter thread, if you want all the citations, just look for my Twitter thread here and you'll get it. As I explained in this Twitter thread, the further bad news is that the 17% drop in carbon emissions is literally the fact that one brick we put on the pile was 17% smaller for 1 month. We've been putting a brick on the pile of our carbon every month since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and actually a little bit before that, thanks to agriculture. The brick has gotten bigger and bigger over time. That's the carbon building up in the atmosphere. And so for 1 month, we put a brick that was 17% smaller on the pile. Do we think that's going to fix climate change? No, it's not. We need to stop putting bricks on the pile, and then we need to start taking some off the pile to fix climate change. As the pandemic passes, we expect carbon emissions to bounce back up again. And in fact, we are already seeing this happening. Why? Because the solutions that were implemented, these draconian solutions that were implemented, they weren't sustainable. We can't shut down the economy. We can't keep kids out of school. We can't take people out of work indefinitely to try to fix climate change too. So does that mean it's hopeless? No, I would actually say exactly the opposite, and here's why. Stick with me here. The reason the pandemic is not going to fix climate change long-term is because the reductions were not achieved through sustainable changes in human behavior. They were achieved through unsustainable changes. To fix climate change, we need sustainable solutions like what? Using our energy more efficiently, altering our behavior so we don't need as much, and getting our energy from sources that produce less carbon. And the good news is the solutions are here. Did you know that according to a report released in September 2019, the US could cut its carbon emissions in half just through efficiency alone? And that's saving money, just efficiency. We know that 6 years ago was the year when this was published. 6 years ago was when new fossil fuel installations dropped below 50% of new energy installations. More than 50% were clean energy, and today we're over 70%. These changes are happening in very unexpected places and ways. People who live in energy poverty are having their lives revolutionized by these clean energy innovations. Project Drawdown is a fantastic resource that talks about not only how do we shrink the size of the bricks we put on the pile, but also how we can take the bricks off the pile through sequestering carbon in the biosphere, through coastal wetland protection, coastal wetland restoration, conservation agriculture, and more. Adaptation and mitigation solutions in one package that benefit us and benefit the biosphere as well. Here's why this is so hopeful. If our emission reductions 17% globally, 25% in China alone. If our emission reductions had been achieved through sustainable climate solutions, the impact would have been enormous. Remember what I said is needed for the Paris Agreement. For the Paris Agreement, we have to cut our emissions 40 to 60% by 2030. If the changes that we achieved in 1 month were sustainable, we would be almost halfway to our goal in just a few weeks. Halfway to our climate goal in a few weeks if we'd achieved those carbon emission reductions sustainably. So that shows us that when we have to act, we can. And not only that, but climate change and the coronavirus pandemic are completely connected. As the United Nations announced just recently, this is a study from just last week, if we curb climate change, we can protect the environment to prevent future pandemics as well. And although the news in the United States is frankly discouraging, with the administration using the pandemic to roll back even more environmental regulations than they were before, if you look at the news in other countries, it is encouraging. As this article, I think from Scientific American said, we're learning how to address climate change from coronavirus. We can adopt measures to increase our quality of life, increase the health of our ecosystems, and also cut our carbon emissions at the same time. Like what? Well, for example, in Canada, to get coronavirus COVID relief, you have to have your climate impact statement. It's mandatory. In cities around the world, they're turning roads into pedestrian areas to cut traffic. Carbon Brief has a fantastic collection on their website of all the green stimulus measures that are being implemented. Because the bottom line is this: both climate change and coronavirus threaten the health and safety of our families, our friends, our loved ones, our communities, our countries, our ecosystems. Both of them affect the economy, our resource availability, national security, things that everybody care about. Both of them disproportionately affect the sick, the young, the old, the poorest, the most vulnerable, both here and abroad. We already know that both are a threat multiplier. They take issues like what? Like poverty. They take issues that already exist like poverty and they make them worse, increasing the economic gap already between the richest and poorest countries. They take issues like development and global health and make them worse. Coronavirus specifically takes issues even of racism and vulnerability to air pollution and makes them worse. Climate change and coronavirus are both threat multipliers that take everything we already care about and makes it worse. And so I love this article here. What's your big excuse for not making big changes? Coronavirus and climate change are intertwined. Both of them need our urgent attention, because both of them affect us all. And the bottom line is this: the planet's health is our health. Thank you. If you want more, sorry, I forgot about this. We've got more Global Weirding episodes on the coronavirus and climate change as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you to both Dr. Hayhoe and Dr. White for sharing your perspectives. So we're gonna get to our audience Q&A in a few minutes, but before we did that, the organizers and I had prepared some questions for you. And so I just wanted to ask you a few of these just to kick things off. So the first question I have goes back to our questionnaire. So one respondent noted, quote, "If people don't have steady jobs and economic opportunities, if they are choosing between paying for healthcare and food, and if they can't find stable and affordable housing, they certainly aren't going to buy more expensive organic foods, use expensive alternative energy, or really engage or care about conservation. But if we build conservation into the conversation as critical to quality of life, we can make that connection and create that opportunity," end quote. So where do you see the opportunities for practitioners to make those connections between economic and environmental justice and conservation?
I feel like in many ways that comment actually answered the question, didn't it? So often we think, and actually I just gave a presentation this morning to the ESRI conference that is going to be recorded and you can watch it later. So many times we think that the first step to fixing issues like climate change and environmental degradation, the first step is doing something expensive, right? Whether it's trying to figure out, can we afford an electric car or solar panels or making some expensive change. But the reality is that simply having a conversation that connects the dots between what we already care about and why this issue matters to what we already care about, and the top 3 things on our own priority list, is the single most important thing that any of us can do, because it makes us realize that caring about these issues means caring about what we already care about and who we already are. And it shows us how the steps to take may not be those expensive first steps we thought of, although they certainly help if we can afford them. But the steps that we take might be simply increasing awareness, educating our kids, telling people around us what actions we as a group or an organization or a region or a city can do that conserve, provide green space, for example, actually provide local food, might help contribute to our health, reduce air pollution, help our kids spend more time outside. It all goes together in a giant package. Kyle, I would love to hear your further thoughts on this.
Great, and good to hear the connections that you're making, Catherine. And from my perspective, when we think of Indigenous conservation, Native folks have been focused on the importance of how climate change relates to food and to water. And we've actually seen that those are 2 of sort of the stress focal points for harms and risks that Native people are facing with respect to COVID-19, right? I mean, increased severity of drought, for example, and its connection to access of water, then creates a system for access to water that can create greater exposure for people. Similar to food, if you're not in a position to get nutritious food locally, whether it's through your own efforts or through local community processes, then you're dependent on sources that for many Native people are quite difficult to get to and quite far away and subject to market mechanisms that aren't fantastic for Native people's income and financial well-being. For urban Native communities, one of the biggest areas of need has been urban conservation and climate change work. Often urban Native communities aren't focused in like a particular identifiable neighborhood, but are in all sorts of different parts of cities. And these efforts to unify and to generate communication across Native people, even when they live in different places in metropolitan area, can be very important for providing the basic network for generating communication during a public health crisis. And that's a final thing that I want to emphasize, is that when Native people are adamant about the importance of revitalizing and maintaining traditional foods and maintaining ancient relationships to water, they're not just about the discrete species or the discrete element or flow. They're about all of the social coordination and relationality that goes with it, which is precisely what enables communication, what enables trust, what enables processes that value consent. And so I think we've seen in cases where we've had programs like some of the ones I'm part of that have been place-based for 6 years, it was a lot easier to convert those to an online format and use them as a way to build a platform for information sharing about how to cope with COVID-19 than it was with programs that were starting anew for the first time, and their first iteration would be online. And so conservation is one of the most exciting areas in which that relationality and that coordinated capacity can be generated for Native people. And I think we can see that that will serve our communities well in public health and other crisis situations.
Thank you both for responding to that. COVID-19 inevitably and necessarily has the spotlight now, but as a society, how do we sustain the progress on climate adaptation and wildlife conservation while responding simultaneously to natural and human disasters like pandemics and extreme weather events and other major environmental and economic disruptions?
Do you want to start that one, Kyle?
Sure. So I think for those of us in the climate change world, I think it puts in perspective the work we need to be doing in actual planning, because whereas a lot of times we think that the current strategies for climate change planning, such as vulnerability assessment and the assessment of adaptivity options, is something relatively new and something relatively, unseen in a lot of municipal, state, federal, and tribal governments. Planning for pandemics and for other types of outbreaks is really not something that a lot of people, I think, would think is completely new or completely unprecedented, right? There are processes and there is scientific knowledge and other types of knowledge that's highly relevant, and I had just assumed was fairly non-controversial. And I think that for those of us who have maybe rest assured that if we were able to do a climate change plan with a tribe, that was where the responsibility ended, with no further scenario planning or no further strategizing about what would happen when that plan and the policies in that plan actually have to be enacted, then we haven't fully followed through with our work as climate change planners. I'll shift it to you, Catherine.
Exactly. So I've posted a bunch of links in the chat there on the different websites I referenced and different articles that talk about how coronavirus recovery, economic recovery, and climate change action can go hand in hand rather than fighting against each other. We have limited resources. We as individuals have limited time. We have limited economic resources. Cities, states, countries have limited resources too. And there's often this perception that somehow wildlife conservation, ecological restoration, climate action, and the economy are opposed to each other. That you have to somehow pick the environment or the economy, as if the economy can float around in outer space without the resources this planet provides. It can't. And so all of those things, climate action, environmental action, ecological restoration, conservation, all of those things are actions for the long-term good of every single living thing on this planet, including us. And so making sure that the co-benefits, to use a buzzword, the co-benefits or all the multiple benefits of our actions are clear is so important. Even something as simple as ecosystem services, where you can actually put a dollar value on the services of what you're conserving. It helps people understand that the way that we've been valuing things the last few decades and centuries is not really the right way. And we can take actions that do benefit us all, both short-term and long-term, if we just kind of widen our perspective a little bit.
Thank you. So I want to go back to one of our questions that appeared in the survey. So we asked our respondents who they would want on their dream team and what they would want to study. And so many respondents wanted their dream team study to focus on moving towards engaging the public in meaningful ways. So for example, one respondent said, quote, "I'd like to know what techniques are most effective in changing the American mindset on climate and conservation," end quote. So seeing how the public has reacted to the COVID-19 crisis, what are the most important tools to promote an effective and equitable message for conservation? And as a second part to that question, what are your feelings about crossing the line between science and advocacy?
So this is something that I think about quite a bit. Often we believe that dumping facts and information on people is the best way to address this. But what happens is social science and psychology and neuroscience has shown this actually leads to a vicious cycle. And in fact, I actually have this vicious cycle illustrated and I'd like to share it with you. So our human tendency is when we see something really bad happening, and I have it illustrated here for climate change. Just a second, let me share my screen with you. I have it illustrated here for climate change, but you could easily put conservation and habitat destruction in this orange circle right here. Okay, just a second, play here. So we see something bad happening. Whether it's habitat destruction, whether it's extinction, whether it's climate change, we see something bad happening. We're worried, and we should be worried. It's very bad. So what do? What we do is we share more scary data because we believe that if people don't understand why it's a big deal, they need more bad news. But what neuroscience has showed us is that when we receive new information, if we don't agree with that information, our brain shuts off. Isn't that crazy? So we reject the information even more, the more scary information we get if we didn't agree with it in the first place. So the result is inaction. And as neuroscientist Tali Sharot says, she studies people's brains, she says, fear and anxiety cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up, rather than take action. And so the original problem just gets worse. So our initial instinct to just give people more scary information about something, it's actually counterproductive. And in her book, The Influential Mind, which I just finished reading, she actually goes on to talk about how the overflow of information actually increases polarization, because the more of it we shove away, the more polarized we get. It's like when you're swimming in the water, you push something away, it pushes you in the opposite direction. So the answer when we see something really bad happening is not more scary information. The answer, and I'm cutting right to the chase here from a lot of different things, the answer is, let me show you the same diagram but in a different way. Here we go. Share this, okay. The answer is when we see something bad happening and we're worried, so far it's the same thing, break the cycle. How do we break the cycle? Rather than sharing more scary information with people, share information very specifically about how it matters to them, how conservation matters to them, how ecological restoration might matter to them, how it might benefit them. Number one. And number two, positive solutions we can take that help rather than hurt, that they see as constructive rather than punitive. So what happens then? People feel empowered. People feel like acting. And to quote Tali again, she says, the human brain is built to associate moving forward, either mentally or physically, moving forward with a reward, not avoiding harm. Isn't that interesting? So often we're trying to get people to move forward, to act, to avoid harm, but that actually runs counter to the wiring of our brains. Our brains are wired to move forward to get a reward and to freeze to avoid harm. As you may understand, of course, if you study animals, right? So if we reframe the way we talk about something so the information we provide induces hope rather than dread, that's how we get people to move forward. Isn't that absolutely fascinating?
I'd like to build off of some of the good points that Catherine made, especially about this, issue of scary stories, in climate change, but also with COVID. Oftentimes the subjects of scary stories are Native people, and Native people are used and abused by journalists and others, right, to do exactly what Catherine was talking about, which is to invoke a certain response in people. And it's been a problem for both the reasons that Catherine outlined, but also if we're focused on Native people or people of color, right, that it sort of oftentimes reaffirms certain assumptions about racism and gender inequity, among other areas. And what I'd actually ask of conservation and climate change professionals is, why don't we have more stories out there about incredible long-term things that tribes are doing and empowered partners? I mean, they're out there, but why aren't they richer? Why aren't they being produced more by tribes? And as many of you will recognize, that oftentimes there's not the funding support to, from the federal government, from state governments, from NGOs to generate the capacity needed for that degree of impact with those projects. But why is that? And I think one of the important things to recognize is that tribes do not necessarily need to be in the position to be dependent on certain funding sources. Federally recognized tribes are sovereigns. We have our own governments. We have a capacity to raise money in ways that support our communities, but we've been challenged by issues of tax codes, of policies, of jurisdictional issues. And oftentimes conservation and climate change professionals I know are not educated on what those issues are. They're not taking a step back and thinking about what are the prior conditions that make it possible for there to be less funding and support for those projects. And when we don't educate ourselves on those issues, we don't advocate for change in those issues with how we vote, with whether we write letters to people in Congress, to what we retweet and signal boost on social media. And so I think another kind of back angle into the idea of publicity and storytelling in the public sphere is, are we actually using all of our capacities as citizens to be able to make change a few steps back that will empower the people we care about and matter, to really have their stories out there and to really be inspiring and to create that conception of benefit.
I love that you said that. You're so right. So first of all, connecting the dots to us personally is really important, as opposed to people who live far away and look different than us, which you're right, is used in a way that is not only ineffective, but it's actually offensive. And then sharing the good news stories, because we move forward to hope. And so often all the stories about climate change are bad. In fact, I gave a talk once on hope a couple of months ago. I went to CNN's website the morning of that talk, and I looked at 35 headlines down CNN's website. Not a single one was positive. Over half of them were definitely negative. Some of them were just neutral, and not a single one was positive. So positive news is seriously lacking, and any stories that we can tell need to be told and shared. And I try to share those on social media as much as I can, but really having those stories to share is how we can encourage people.
Thank you both. That's really interesting perspectives, a lot to unpack there. So speaking of kind of good news, the pandemic has really highlighted society's capacity for sweeping transformational change. And many of these changes, and I'm thinking of like teleworking or using our cars less, are really environmentally friendly and climate friendly. So I'm wondering, how do we leverage these sustainable practices that we're using now into the future and make that business as usual?
I love that question because, well, first of all, I shared in the chat a link to the Carbon Brief article where they're actually collecting all the green actions that people are taking around the world at the city level and the state level and the business level. But individually, I stepped on the carbon scales about 8 years ago to measure my carbon footprint. And again, this was 8 years ago, please remember that. I was very surprised to learn that the biggest part of my personal carbon footprint was my travel. And I don't go to yoga retreats in Bali. In fact, yesterday was our 20th wedding anniversary, and it made me realize that our honeymoon was the last vacation that we had flown to that didn't involve either family or work. So we don't take these exotic vacations around the world, 1 in 20 years. But it was flying to scientific meetings, to conferences, to research areas, to talk to people about climate change. And so I thought to myself, well, first of all, talking about climate change is really important, number one. But second of all, isn't there a different way we could do it? So I set off over the last few years to deliberately try to transition, as I mentioned, about 80% of the talks I give to virtual talks. But up until this past February, I was still getting people saying, oh, I don't know, we've never done a virtual talk before. I'm not sure that we can actually do this. Our scientific societies were saying, we've never done a virtual conference. I'm not sure if we can really do this. And then all of a sudden the pandemic hit. And all of a sudden, guess what? It turns out we can. We can do everything. I just spoke at the ESRI conference, which is a huge conference. It typically has 18,000 people attend in San Diego every year. They went 100% virtual this year. You know how many people attended? 65,000. The American Geophysical Union, which has long resisted going online, is finally going online this year. I don't know what their registration is, but I'm willing to bet it's more. So there are absolutely changes that we have been able to make that show us there's a different and a better way to live. And I certainly hope that we will continue to take those with us into the future.
Just briefly building off of Catherine's points, you know, I work a lot in the coalition building space, and you know, we were oftentimes confronted, especially in the social justice movement, with some of the contradictions between flying on airplanes and using carbon intensive methods to have meetings that gathered Indigenous people. You know, and a lot of people would talk about the importance of being able to build trust and consent and reciprocity face to face with communities that have been separated from each other by generations of colonialism, capitalism, and industrialization. And what's interesting, and this is really quite in line, at least in my interpretation with what Catherine shared, is that a lot of us thought it wasn't possible to engage in kind of conflict-sensitive facilitation, especially with new people in an online context. And certainly in a lot of the in-person events that I would do, I mean, I took a lot of care to to kind of manage the entire landscape and space, to use traditional protocols and traditional strategies for welcoming people and getting people to have a level of trust and accountability to each other. And so shoot, when I tried to do some stuff online at first, it was like the most boring thing ever, and it wasn't conducive. But then some people really brought in some techniques and thought creatively about how to use video, how to use cameras, how to use the things that we don't think about in terms of the sound and the camera. And we're really demonstrating to actually, maybe not all cases, but a number of cases that we thought it would be impossible to build collegiality and coalition, we actually can do it online. And I think regardless of what happens in the future, it's going to quicken some of the relationship building that we've been longing for and looking for, and that it might make it easier for some of us to build the relationships we need to achieve certain measures that will advance social and climate justice.
Sorry, I had some trouble getting my mute off. Thank you both for answering some of those questions. And I have many more, and I'd love to ask you all of them, but I really want to get to some of our audience Q&A, because I know they have been thinking about this a lot, and they would love to hear your perspectives and thoughts on some of these. So now I'm going to turn it over to my other friend and colleague, Mike Langston. Mike, you have some of the audience Q&As for us?
Yes, I do. Great questions coming in. So the first one I'm going to throw out to Dr. White. This question is, how do we do a better job at connecting with environmental justice and climate change adaptation?
I appreciate the question, and I think it has a lot to do with what has been shared so far, that all of us in the conversation have shared so far regarding COVID-19 and the public health crisis, is that, public health, climate change, environmental justice, these are issues about how space, how land, how landscapes have been transformed, have been changed, and that have been done in a way that's reflected the interests of certain populations against the interest of other populations. And so, to make kind of a long story short, I think that if one is engaged in, say, climate change planning as a process or climate change mitigation as a process, if one has somehow lost track of the, for lack of a better word, the constructiveness of landscapes, how particular forces and populations and cultures have shaped it, and the business interests that are entangled with it, then maybe one's not going to be engaged in climate change work that's going to support a conversation about environmental justice.
Thank you, Dr. White. Catherine, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I would say, as I said before, that the only reason why we care again about climate change is because of what we already care about. So often we think it's like a separate silo, and then there's competition. How much of our time, how much of our resources, how much of our effort are we going to put on this or this? But if we really think of it holistically, climate change is a threat multiplier, taking issues of environmental justice and making them worse, affecting people who are already marginalized, who are already vulnerable. Climate change disproportionately affects people who are poor, people who are racial minorities. It disproportionately affects women and girls. It disproportionately affects everybody who is already disadvantaged, who are already fighting for justice for. And so, again, by definition, if we already care about justice in any sphere, in any capacity, we already care about climate change, even if we haven't consciously connected the dots.
Thank you, Catherine. And now Amy is going to ask our next question. Amy?
Hi, all right. Thank you, everybody, for these great questions and answers for Dr. Hayhoe and Dr. White. Our second most voted question, I think, is about parallels between climate denial and COVID denial and mistakes that have been made. I think, Dr. Hayhoe, you have already answered that question so excellently with that diagram. So I'm going to move on to our question with 10 votes, which is, I love Dr. White's comments about building relationships that are both long-term and encompass a more holistic approach to conservation, not just going from project to project. Do you have any successful examples of relationships like this?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. I think especially for for conservation professionals and conservation climate change scientists that there are some publicly accessible examples of what certain types of long-term relationships look like. And some of the ones that are oftentimes easiest to find, at least in the kind of the United States context, involve the treaty organizations. So for example, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission is a intertribal indigenous organization that is in a co-management relationship and stewards lands that were ceded in certain treaties. Or for example, the work of the Treaty Rights at Risk Initiative among the treaty tribes of Western Washington. So I think some of those multi-tribal organizations are important examples, but I also encourage people in their local context to actually go up on some of the websites of federally recognized tribes and where possible too, state and unrecognized tribes, and actually see who some of the partnerships are with and which ones have endured. And sometimes that information is accessible. And then finally, I'd suggest that tribal colleges are excellent places to think through some of those projects. You know, I've worked for about 10 years with the Sustainable Development Institute at the College of Menominee Nation, which is an indigenous research organization. It was founded in 1994 and really had their finger on issues of sustainability even before some other people in the world were thinking about it as adamantly as they are now. Thanks for your question.
Dr. Hayhoe, do you want to provide some examples as well?
There we go. Yes, I love to learn from these, and someone just posted a nice video on Climate Hope. Maybe we could share that with the whole group. But I love hearing about these stories because an ideal project or an ideal effort would include both short-term benefits and long-term benefits. It would tackle climate change and health and well-being and conservation. It could even help with economic growth and education, and definitely level the playing field in terms of justice and equity. So projects, for example, where people who never had access to energy before, and they don't have access to fossil fuel resources where you have to keep paying for them, they are empowered, literally, with wind or solar energy where you never have to pay for the wind or the sun once you've got the technology. And that means things like they can have lights on at night so their kids can study and go to school in the morning. They can have a pump on the well so they don't have to work pumping water all day, and they can actually do other things. Or I love new agricultural techniques where by storing carbon in the soil through, you know, some techniques that have been around for thousands of years and others that are newer, farmers can actually increase the quality of their soil, increase their yields, and at the same time sequester carbon rather than producing it. So these types of stories really make me encouraged and give me hope because it shows how we can benefit both short-term and long-term from meaningful climate solutions. And again, our brains are wired to move towards reward and to freeze when we're afraid or when there's guilt or fear. And so these types of solutions actually literally move us forward, and that's what we need.
Great, thank you. I did share that video on Climate Hope with all attendees. And we will also, as folks have brought stuff into the chat, if we didn't manage to share it, we will capture all of that at the end and send all those resources out when we send the link to this presentation at the end. Mike, I'll turn it over to you for the next question.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Catherine, one of the slide that you showed early on that had the illustration of the thermometer showed that we are currently on course to see a 4 degrees C higher temperature in the not too distant future. We have a question that is for U.S. conservation. What would adaptation to a 4 degrees C higher temperature look like? That's hard for us to wrap our minds around.
It is. And you know me, Mike, you know I like to be as glass half full as possible. But on this one, it is hard to give any type of water in the glass answer at all. So just some context. From paleoclimate history, we know it's been warmer before. But we know that human civilization wasn't around then. So though the planet will survive, our civilization is at just as much risk as the polar bears because it's built on the assumption of a stable climate. But what we also know is that the rate of change is unprecedented. And the rate of change matters critically for ecosystem adaptation. So just to give you an idea, our temperature is currently changing, depending on where in the world you are, between 10 to 50 times faster than between the last ice age and now. The amount of carbon that we are putting into the atmosphere, over 10 gigatons of carbon per year, as far back as we can go in paleoclimate times, the nearest analog to that is about 55 million years ago. And at that time, it's estimated that 1/10 the carbon was going into the atmosphere due to natural processes that we are putting in from digging up and burning fossil fuels today. So in terms of adaptation to a 4-degree world, the question is not just 4 degrees, the question is how fast are we getting to 4 degrees? If we get to 4 degrees in 1,000 years, that would look radically different than if we get to 4 degrees in 100 years. And if we get there in 100 years, as we're currently on track to do, I feel like conservation would look like triage. It would literally look at triage, because how fast things are changing, we would literally be trying to pick up species and do that thing that people are talking about already today, where you pick them up and you try to put them somewhere else and see if they'll grow. I mean, the city of Chicago is already replanting trees that die with trees that are native to Southern Illinois, so that when they reach maturity, they'll actually be native to their climate. But if it changes that fast, they won't even be native to climate over the lifetime of the tree. And what about endangered species? Where do you pick them up and put them? So 4 degrees Celsius, the planet will survive, but human civilization would be at serious risk of not surviving, not humans in general as a race, but civilization. And the extinctions, it's really hard to estimate because we haven't even really seen anything like this. I mean, you could have the asteroid extinctions, but it's not quite the same thing. Some estimates are, 30% of species could be completely wiped out. So what would conservation look like? I don't know if I can even wrap my head around it. But here's the thing. You know that I study the future. So I look at what the difference is between a 2, a 3, and a 4-degree future. In fact, we're actually developing a brand new data set of these projections for Esri, where we actually look at specifically 2, 3, and 4 degrees. So instead of looking at RCP 8.5 or SSP 370, you can look at 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, and what that means in terms of growing degree days, days over 100 degrees, days below freezing. And in most places in the world, the difference between a 2 degree and a 4 degree warming is the difference between the survival of what we know or its loss.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Catherine. Dr. White, what are your thoughts on this? And also, what are your thoughts about what a 4-degree higher temperature outlook would be for Native communities?
Yeah, I appreciate that we're having a chance to discuss this. And I wanted to bring in a couple of threads that are also tied to some of the previous topics that were discussed about skepticism and people's attitude toward climate change and to public health. I think on the other side of the spectrum from skepticism is something that Native people and people of color are very sensitive to, which is that many advocates for making transformations to respond to climate change and avoid dangerous climate change, they can oftentimes be motivated, at least in terms of how they phrase things, by the idea that we want to protect something that's normal. And I think from our perspective, as Native people, but again, many communities share this, once you've accepted that there's something normal about today, then you've opened up any solutions or ideas you have to being susceptible to generating further injustice. So for example, say that the United States had gotten its act together much, much faster, much more efficiently to address COVID-19. Even if it had done that, and I'm just speculating here, I think it's highly plausible that still the numbers of people that would have died had been skewed toward affecting people of color, people with disabilities, people facing economic hardships more than other members of our society. And so if somebody would then say, well, that was a fantastic response by the United States and led the way, but you had these inequalities, that's not a fantastic response. And that's not a return to something that any of our communities would feel is normal. And so with COVID-19, there was oftentimes a rush to get back to normal. With climate change, it's oftentimes trying to protect what's normal. Very, very similar. And similar with the 4-degree rise and with other scenarios with respect to climate change, right? You know, for a lot of our communities, we've gone through massive human-induced climate change in the past, and actually were exploited in historic panics, especially by Europeans, about climate change. I think Catherine's example of moving species around is a good one, because a lot of historians during the climate crisis of the 1600s, when people thought that there was going to be a massive cooling, they were actually trying to figure out whether plants that grew in North America that were tended by native people and perhaps other species too could grow autonomously in England. And so they dealt with the climate crisis at the time by trying to steal or exploit indigenous knowledge and erasing indigenous people out of the equation. And I don't think that propensity has changed today. We've seen that with the most rapid solutions for mitigating climate change, that where you have cases of implementation, that there are injustices. And because Native people have oftentimes seen the collapse of, 98% or more of the species that they depended on, and the complete terraforming of the landscapes that they'd cultivated for generations, then a rapid, quick change like Catherine was describing is really devastating because it can undermine the hard work that our communities have done to protect the responsibilities that we can enact and remain. And so I think that's an important intersection with environmental justice and climate change. And I would really challenge anybody to consider how they think or use terms like normal, or how they think about what's precedented or unprecedented.
Thank you, Kyle. Amy?
Yes, and I just want to remind everyone as we're moving into about our last 15 minutes here, there are still some great questions coming in. So I want to invite you to go back and add any more questions if you'd like to, or continue to upvote some of those new questions if you're particularly interested in having them answered. I want to build now on some of these issues of avoiding despair and moving forward. So the question is, without sugarcoating the probable losses, such as habitats and species, how can we avoid despair by focusing on opportunities to reconfigure our political and economic systems in the face of climate and COVID catastrophes? So let's start thinking big. And I should add that in our survey, we had a lot of people really saying we need to think big and we need to completely rethink our whole economy and our whole political and value systems. So please respond to that, whichever order you prefer.
Well, I love that question. I would say that the number one objection that I hear from people who accept that climate change is real and it's serious and we need to act, the number one objection to action is this: we need to fix X first. So X can be, we need to fix Citizens United first, that gives corporations the right of an individual. We need to fix our democratic system first. We need to fix our infinite growth economic model first. We need to fix our political polarization first, and then we can fix climate change. And my answer to that is, or even people who say we need to fix injustice first, or racism first, or sexism first, or inequity first, my answer is, if we wait until we fix those things, it'll be too late. Climate change will fix us. The reality is that climate change, again, it's a threat multiplier. So it takes all of these issues and it multiplies them. But if you flip it around, solid, robust, sustainable climate solutions will also fix those other issues. If a climate solution will not help move at least one of those other issues forward, whether it's poverty, racism, injustice, sexism, the myth of infinite growth, if it will not move one of those things forward, it's not a robust, sustainable climate solution. So it's like we're embedded in this system and we have to take a step forward, and the step forward will actually help in other ways. And then we take a next step forward and we see more of the horizon. But if we just wait until we have a map of the whole thing to fix it, by then it'll be too late.
Thank you. Dr. White?
Yeah, thanks for those amazing points, Catherine. One angle I've thought about this question in relation to is, when we think about, well, what can we do as individuals or as people that have influenced locally with certain communities to make that systematic change? And I think it's important to recognize that systematic change itself is a fairly neutral concept. I mean, you can enact systematic change that is pretty evil at the end of the day, even if the intentions are good, or you can act systematic change that promotes justice and well-being. And I think we need to figure out ways to catch ourselves in terms of where we're actually at. And one strategy I think of a lot is, if you were to take how you think about your relation to systematic change, imagine that in terms of what science fiction character you would be. Because in a lot of science fiction, actually, the characters that we associate with people that ultimately do pretty bad things are ones that have these high exalted visions of either peace or, or a world with no health problems. But the problem is how they carry out those plans and the speed and the expectation of when the work will be completed. And I think what we've found historically in every stage of colonialism is that the worst oppression is oftentimes framed with the very best of, intentions and goals to making systematic change. And we oftentimes think that we're beyond that because we're the people that currently live, but that's actually what every generation thought. And the violence that we're in a position to commit ourselves will likely be seen in the future as on par with historic forms of violence over the last couple hundred years or before. And so the question is, right, how do we understand the fact that as people seeking systematic change, that we ultimately can't control the systems and how they operate? We can't control other people. And so what are our expectations? If you were to find evidence that you could never feel that you had a role in promoting systematic change, that there'd be no reason for hope. If that's where you're at, I think you need to reorient your values and think very carefully about what it means to live in a world that's this dynamic and that is this scarred by violence. And so in some of my work, just briefly, I've looked at the fact that some of the indigenous persons who I admire most, people like Jeanette Armstrong, for example, major environmentalists and leaders, have said statements that indicate that for them, it's more than just about hope. It's more than just about systematic change. It's about building kinship and building capacity. And you know what? If we can't do anything about it, if it's too late, but we focused on building those kinship relations, that reciprocity, that consent, that accountability, that transparency, that trust, then that's a motivator of our actions, not just hope.
Hope and love.
Thank you both so much for those answers, and we're going to move to Mike for the last question.
Okay, for this one, we are going to try to tap into 3 different questions here. So this is going to be a little bit of a challenge for the moderator. So I'll do my best. So we have a question that was upvoted quite a bit, especially towards the end of the discussion here. And the end part of that one is, what are your thoughts about the role of forest management and climate change, and how can we better communicate that to others? And we've talked some already about communication. And this kind of goes, well, maybe it doesn't. There's another question about defensiveness. And Catherine, do you want to try to address these 2?
I'll just jump in too. There's also a question about lowering the barrier for scientists to talk to people and the people in their communities, and how do you blend the personal and professional as a scientist? So how do we communicate in a way that captures both our personal and professional aspects of our lives, thinking about whether that's with climate, with forest management, with COVID, with any of these big issues?
I do think they are related, and here's why. So as scientists and as academics, we're often implicitly taught to strip ourselves of all our biases that make us human and just be essentially the disembodied brain in the jar. Now, of course, we do want our science to be unbiased, but the reality is this brain is sitting in a body that has all kinds of emotions, has all kinds of cultural framing and perspectives that are implicit in who we are and how we understand data and communicate data. And so rather than stripping ourselves of our bias and our emotions, I think a more genuine way to communicate is to recognize that they exist and to be conscious of ourselves, how we feel And a lot of scientists are experiencing enormous grief and anxiety when we look at our data. Be honest about it to ourselves about how we feel. Be aware of the emotions that people who we're talking to may have. And as appropriate, either address those, you can address them implicitly or explicitly through understanding, for example, and this relates to the defensiveness here, understanding that the predominant emotions many people feel, even those who officially reject the climate change, they feel guilt. They feel guilt because we're told that, I mean, literally, I was sitting at a table once in a round table of faith leaders, and somebody turned to everybody else at the table and said, you know, when you're turning on a car, you're sinning. I thought to myself, oh, fine. So coming to this meeting was sinning, going to school or the university or taking my child to the doctor is sinning. Thank you so much. I felt like going out, finding the nearest Hummer, is in Texas, so I could still find one, and driving around and going, sinning, I'm sinning. Because that guilt was so overwhelming. There's no way that we feel like we can live. We're told that we can't have children. We can't travel to see our families. We're told that we can't do all these things. And so we get very defensive about it, because why do we go see our families? For that love and connection that Kyle was talking about. Why do we go to work? To earn money to feed our family. Why do we go to our study site as a scientist? To try to understand this planet we live on. So when the whole tree planting thing came up, it was a tremendous relief, because all of a sudden there was a positive forward solution where we could plant a ton of trees and feel great about ourselves. It was like the indulgences the Catholic Church sold in the Middle Ages for people who were sinning. We could buy trees and then we'd be okay. We'd be wiped clean. The slate would be empty. We wouldn't have to feel guilty anymore. So that's why people seized on this passion for planting trees. And of course, there's a place and a time for that. Although, as the commenter pointed out, there's also a place and a time for not doing that. There's a place and a time for that, but we seized on it because of our emotions. So in terms of effective communication, I think that recognizing the emotions of the people who we're trying to communicate with, sympathizing with them to the extent that we're able to, and then communicating with them in a way that does not raise their defensiveness, does not increase their guilt and their fear, but rather increases their sense of connection, as Kyle said, their hope. They're feeling that there's more that we have in common than what divides us. That's how we can effectively connect with people to move forward. And so I actually have a whole TED Talk that talks all about that, and I'll put it in the comment here. But Kyle, I would love to hear more from you about this, because I feel like you often engage with people's emotions in a very different way.
Yeah, those were awesome responses, Catherine. And I wanted to, to build off of the way in which you spoke to the prompts, and to use that to sort of address this question about science and activism, because in thinking about some of the emotions and some of the positivity that Catherine was describing, that's really how I've tried to reshape this question about science and activism, especially as it relates to those of us working in environmental areas. So I think it's important to remember that every single society and culture that ever was had some institutions of science. They all did. If science is reliable, peer-reviewed, socially endorsed process for providing reliable information, everybody had science. All different scientific institutions have are prone to different mistakes. They have particularly good angles on understanding certain issues. But if I were just to speculate widely, and I would actually say that there's really just been a couple of scientific traditions that thought that scientists were not activists, and that kind of took the love, took the positivity, took the advocacy out of science. And it happens to be the ones that are most common, like here in the United States at some of the universities that we work in and the research institutions. But I think for those of us that are trying to figure out what it means, it's sometimes very helpful to reorient our thoughts and say, well, wait a minute, even if I'm stuck in this institution that's very cautious about whether I should do advocacy and how I should do it, but actually the burden of world science is speaking to you actually to advocate, right? And to practice ways in which you can be evidence-based, you can be informed by your expertise and informed by reliable information, and speak to issues that are more than just advising policymakers, but are inspiring other people. And I think a lot of the examples that Catherine's talked about really speak to that, and really demonstrate a way of science communication that we don't see as much as we should, and that just go way beyond the provision of information, and are much more active in the emotional lives of people who themselves want to be inspired and want to be motivated and want the love and the positivity and the relationality. And so I'd really encourage people to think about and study those other traditions of science and the roles that scientists had and the responsibilities that scientists have, and to sort of remove some of the privilege and narrowness of science as a lot of us commonly are used to using it today.
Thank you both so much for the conversation. We talked about a lot of things, really dug into some concepts, and I've been seeing the chat. A lot of people have really learned a lot out of this conversation. So thank you. I know we're just past our time, but I do want to maybe ask for our speakers to kind of sum up, if you can, in a sentence or two, what is a big takeaway you want our participants to have from the discussions today? And while you think about that, I'll give you a minute. I do want to just remind everyone, we will have a recording of this that we will share with everyone who registered, and it will also be up on the AFWA YouTube page. We'll share the links that people have put in the chat box, as well as the slides later on. And we will put together a report on that questionnaire and share that with folks later on this summer. So now maybe if I can start with Dr. White, do you have any final thoughts for everyone?
Sure. The way I think about it, and the way I think my tribe and a lot of other Native communities I know think about things is, what makes our lives meaningful as actors is all the small and large stories that we're part of. And I think our small stories, when they're connected to bigger stories, right, they become the most meaningful, the most inspiring, and we're able to handle challenges the most. But as many of us know, especially in the fields represented here by the participants, we're oftentimes jammed into these tiny, tiny stories. We lose track of what they mean to the larger stories that we're part of. And if you are feeling that way, and if when COVID-19 emerged as a public health crisis, if you really felt contained and constrained by that and the work you were doing, I'd encourage you to know that the public health crisis is exposing us again to why work that may have been particularized is part of a bigger story, whether that's for Native people or others. And so it's a chance to re-motivate and to re-energize and to feel grateful for the opportunities we have to transform how we think about work that we've been doing.
Thank you, Dr. White. I am grateful for the conversation today. Dr. Ajejo, your final thoughts.
I couldn't agree more. We live in a world that has become increasingly fragmented, and a lot of that is due to the massive flow of information that we're confronted with every day. So we've gotten to the point where we feel like, well, I'm not that type of person. These type of people care about climate change. These type care about conservation. These care about the economy. These care about local business. These ones care about national security. And we've drawn these lines in the sand around who we are and what we or what other people care about. But the reality is, if we are a human being on this planet, in fact, frankly, if we're any living thing on this planet, then we already care about climate change, about biological and biospheric integrity, about conservation. We already care about these things. We just haven't connected the dots. We don't realize how they affect everything else we already care about, because just as the economy can't float around in outer space, neither can we without the resources this planet provides. And so the important thing is to, rather than continue to implicitly or even explicitly emphasize these artificial lines we've drawn between each other, as in, oh, they're just that type of person and I'm this type of person. Rather than doing that, looking for what we have in common and building bridges to bring ourselves together to connect on these issues. Because, I mean, it's hard to think of a single solution to these issues that couldn't get multiple different people who think they belong in different tribes actually working together to the benefit of us all. And that is how we're going to fix this.
Great, that's great sentiment to end on. Again, I want to thank Dr. Hayhoe and Dr. White for this fantastic conversation. Thank you for your time. And thank you to all of our participants. Thanks to our organizers for making this roundtable happen today. It's been wonderful. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Please stay safe and stay healthy out there. Thank you all so much.